We're really pleased today to have two speakers to share some insights with us. And then, like I said, we will have some discussion afterwards. So our first speaker will be Professor Joanna Shapland. She's a distinguished criminologist and Professor of Criminal Justice at Sheffield University. She's well known for her research and publications in areas including victimisation and restorative justice. She chairs the Restorative Justice Forum in Scotland, and she's also a member of Scotland's Restorative Justice Stakeholder group. We also have Ashley Scotland here with us today. She's the founder and CEO of the charity Thriving Survivors, a charity built on personal experience that supports people who have experienced trauma, abuse or violence on their journey of recovery. She is also a member of Scotland's Restorative Justice Stakeholder group, and she's taken the lead in developing a specialist restorative justice service for survivors of sexual violence as part of Scotland's evolving restorative justice provision. So we look forward to hearing from her about that. So without further ado, Joanna, would you like to start us off with what you have to share with us today?
Yes, I'll try sharing my screen and hopefully sharing what I want to share and not all of my emails or something like that. That looks okay to me. Hopefully, is that okay?
Yes, looks great. I can see that.
Brilliant, good, excellent. So can I say I'm going to be focusing on the progress and what's happened in Scotland, but I also want to set it in the context of implementation and the difficulties of implementation, not just in Scotland, but all over the UK and in Europe more generally. And I also should be saying, definitely, that although I am the chair of the Restorative Justice Forum Scotland, I am definitely not speaking for the forum, which is not that kind of organisation anyway. It brings together people from the statutory, voluntary sector, government, etc. in Scotland who are interested in restorative justice. And I'm definitely not speaking on behalf of or for the stakeholder group of the Scottish Government or definitely the Scottish Government. I am aware, looking at the people, the participants for here, that there are some people on this call who are definitely much more expert on what is going on and so forth than I am. And I'm really hoping that they will contribute to a discussion. So what you're getting is my personal view and no more than that. Now, let's try and see whether, yay, if I press hard, the slide changes. So first, to say that I'm dealing with restorative justice, which is in relation to a criminal offence, not some other form of conflict, and that for me, restorative justice means bringing into communication the person who was harmed and the person who has been harmed of the same offence, not in relation to different offences. There are loads of definitions of restorative justice. It is a really fruitful, still academic debate. But what I'm going to take as my definition for today is the Scottish Government's definition right at the start of their statutory guidance in 2017, which is what I've put up on the screen. And what you will see is that it's focusing on communication and contact, dialogue, and particularly emphasizing with the victim, the person who has been harmed in Scottish terminology, and the person who has done the harm. And the victim is very much seen as a really important participant in the whole of this process in Scotland. So we ought to start really with what the various governments actually intend to happen, because it's not fair to judge them on what they don't intend to happen. So looking at what the policy is in the different parts of the UK, In England and Wales, the idea of the government for a long time now is that restorative justice should be available for all offences, by which I mean criminal offences, with an identifiable victim. It should be available as diversion, or if the case is post-conviction, sometimes pre-sentence. We're talking about both adults and young people who have harmed. And there is a statutory duty on the police to tell victims about restorative justice. That's the stated policy. However, we also all know that that's not exactly what's happening in practice. And a number of reports from, for example, the Victims Commissioner has shown that it's a bit of a postcode lottery whether all victims falling under that definition are actually being told about restorative justice, let alone my computer is telling me that I am muted.
I can hear you again now, don't worry.
What did you lose?
No, I'm saying just the last maybe sentence or two.
The last sentence or two. What I was saying, the last sentence or two, I think, was that in England and Wales, the stated policy is up on the screen. That's the government's policy, but it isn't all happening everywhere in practice. That, as reports from the Victims Commission have shown, that it's not everyone's getting told, not everyone's able to access restorative justice, let alone at all relevant stages of the criminal justice process. Now, the progress in Scotland is in some ways behind that in England and Wales, but actually the policy, the stated policy, is very similar to that in England and Wales. And I've taken the quote on the slide from the Scottish Government's implementation policy vision in relation to restorative justice, that it should be available across Scotland to all those who wish to access it at a time that's appropriate for them. And approaches taken must be consistent, evidence-led, trauma-informed, and of a high standard. And I think a lot of people may have been attracted to this session, of course, for their interest in restorative justice generally, but also by the paragraph in bold on the slide, which is from the action plan set out in 2019, which proclaims the vision, the sincere vision, but also the very ambitious vision that restorative justice should be widely available across Scotland by 2023, with the interests of victims at their heart. Well, we're now in May 2024, and definitely we're not there yet. And I could possibly even say we're not even very close to touching it yet. And that's what I want to really talk about today. But finishing off in relation to the UK, in Northern Ireland, the progress is very different in terms of restorative justice availability, because there is statutory restorative justice and has been since the Justice Northern Ireland Act 2001 for offenders, i.e. people who have harmed, who are under 18. And there are now, with the restoration of Stormont, there are now active plans to promote restorative justice and its availability for adult people who have harmed as well. So that's a rather different position. Come on, slide. Change, there we go. So in Scotland, my memory, or going back to the mid-2010s, is that the process really started with a real wish in government to expand the availability of restorative justice and introduce it in places and for groups or ages of people who've harmed where it wasn't there before. There's a long history of introducing restorative justice in different places all over Scotland, but not consistently everywhere. And so the government oomph was to get it available everywhere. But one of the first problems that was realised was that at that point, there were no in-force policies as to what was good practice for all age groups of those who had been doing harm, and or for all people who had been harmed. And there was real worry, which I shared, that there was a possibility that people would have a go at doing things called restorative justice, which actually were not good practice, and that the whole concept might get a bad name because of that. So the first stage was to get all relevant agencies and people together, and that's a whole huge range of agencies and participants and people from criminal justice and so forth, to provide a definition of restorative justice and essentially to produce good practice guide as at that time. Very, very similar to actually the work that the Ministry of Justice in England and Wales did with what was then Restorative Justice Council and is now, and what is now the Council, was the Restorative Justice Consortium at that point earlier in that decade. And the result in Scotland was the guidance, which was published in 2017 and later given statutory effect. And that's really important because it means that this good practice is mandatory on the agencies which are directly controlled by the government in Scotland, which is primarily in this sense the police and the prison service. And it's obviously also good practice for all agencies. And it's a very long document, maybe that was bad, but it tries to cover all sorts of areas of good practice: definitions, core values, duties of facilitators, duties of providers, things like you really must have a complaints mechanism and all those sorts of things. That was great. And everyone had got together, had spent long hours discussing and drafting and coming back on drafts and all of that stuff. And the forum was really quite important in that. But then what? Then you have the massive task of actually making it happen. It needed development, it needed agreement between all the agencies as to how they were going to actually work with each other, how referrals were going to happen, what on earth one was going to do about data protection, and all that sort of stuff, always difficult. It needed training, it needed public awareness, and above all, it needed funding. Because although the research evidence is, not in Scotland, but in England and Wales certainly, that restorative justice can be valued for money, which means that the cost of setting up the schemes is less than the benefit you get in terms of reduced reoffending thereafter. Nonetheless, you've got to have it in the right strand of the budget. And as a new thing, there wasn't essentially a strand of the budget at that point in time. And Scotland is rather different, in my view, from England and Wales and Northern Ireland, because it wasn't really, it had not really had a victims movement, a victims in criminal justice revolution, if you want to call it that, about the importance of the victim and bringing the victim into criminal justice in the same way in Scotland as in England and Wales and in Northern Ireland. So it was starting in a way from a different criminal justice set of values and viewpoints and so forth. And there are huge potential implementation difficulties, which became obvious and are, I think, the same wherever you are and whatever's happening from the different research that I've done. So on this slide, I've listed them, but I've also put Scott and given my sort of own personal viewpoint of where actually things have got to as of now. The most important difficulties are, first of all, telling potential participants. Those potential participants, those who've been harmed, those who have caused harm, hopefully aren't expecting to be in that particular position and role at that time, because crime is, thankfully, in the United Kingdom, not as common as people are going to expect to be victimised tomorrow. So they're not going to know necessarily what the possibilities are when they do become harmed by a crime or something like that. So they will have views and stereotypes of what possibilities are, but they may not be correct. So there's a real need, and I think that's a need everywhere, for publicity, for education, and so forth. And there really has been quite a lot of progress on that in Scotland, which I'll come on to. There's then, how do you actually contact potential participants? Kirby and Jacobson's pilot in London of restorative justice done pre-sentence, half the cases, they weren't actually able to get contact details for victims of it in that pilot. The other half, they did, it all worked and people were very happy. But it's really difficult actually getting up-to-date contact details for victims. And I can see Jeff nodding his head vigorously at that as well. So I fear it's still difficult. To me, one of the most important steps is to make it very clear and accepted by everybody as to how the offer is going to be made to potential participants, how they're going to be told about restorative justice, and which agency is going to take responsibility of ensuring that they are actually informed and can make an informed choice as to what to do and what to decide. That hasn't yet been sorted, to my knowledge, in Scotland. One possibility is referral from criminal justice agency, whichever is the relevant criminal justice agency at that point in the case. And there has been a lot of discussion in the trial area of Lothian Borders about who might do that, what are the difficulties of doing that, and so on. So there's some least serious, concrete, practical thought about that in Scotland so far. And then if you get and you do the restorative justice, what's going to be in the outcome agreement or the conference plan or whatever you're going to call it? And are those options available for the relevant cases that need those options in each part of the country or town or whatever that you're actually trying to do this in? That's been a problem right from the start, for example, in New Zealand. It's been a problem in England, Wales, and elsewhere. Scotland hasn't quite got to that stage yet because there aren't lots of cases going through at this present moment, but it's something that has to be thought about and solved. And the backdrop to all of this is that everyone's familiar with criminal justice working in a certain way. There's a progress of cases. Everybody knows what it is, and it's resourced, and the easy way is to do the normal thing. It's really difficult to change the normal thing and think about referrals and work out what you should do and what are the right cases and all of that sort of stuff. And the difficulty that has happened in all countries in relation to restorative justice is that it's slightly new, and mostly it's an exception to the normal route of doing things. This is not true where restorative justice is mainstreamed and statutory, like in Northern Ireland or New Zealand, but elsewhere it's a problem, and it's a problem everywhere, particularly because if the referral doesn't happen, there are actually usually no consequences for the criminal justice harried, busy person who's got to actually think about doing the referrals. Back to public knowledge. People can have very strange ideas about restorative justice is and how it progresses. So if you just said the words to them, they're not going to know what you're talking about, probably, or have some very strange ideas about it. So there's a real need to inform people what actually it is in that jurisdiction. A really good way is videos that people can watch at their leisure that are available easily, but also people are pointed to. Northern Ireland made a video, and has now made another video, for people that are referred to conferencing there, youth conferencing. Scotland has also made a video, and I have put the link to that in the references slide, which is the last slide, which I promise I will get to hopefully shortly. But even better, Scotland has actually evaluated the usefulness of that video and how much those that watched it felt they really knew more about restorative justice after seeing it. And that's a very rare evaluation, really good. And you have the link to that also on the slide at the end. Making the offer. This is one of the most difficult implementation steps, it seems, in practice. Recent research in England and Wales by myself and colleagues and by Rebecca Bramley suggests strongly that in England and Wales, at least, those who work in criminal justice are still very offender focused, because of course the whole system was set up to deal with those who have committed offences. It's not surprising, this. And they actually may worry about talking to people who have harmed, whether they might themselves do harm if they talk about things, whether they're talking in the right way. They may think that all those who have been harmed are highly vindictive, which is not true at all. And they may be employed in their normal job to protect and to take care of those who have harmed, and so be worried about what it would do to the people they need to protect if they were to bring in those who have been harmed to talk to them, who may go on at them, and all of those sorts of things. I.e., they may be overprotective if their normal job is to care for one party or another, and that is true of those who offend, and it is true of those who've been harmed. So they may want to hear a signal from the person they're talking to, talking about making the offer, that makes it become an opting in process, i.e., the person they're talking to, the potential participant's got to give off some kind of, I'd really like to be in contact with, or something like that, rather than telling them all about it and letting the person they're speaking to decide for themselves. And also, there's a very strong view amongst justice personnel that you should ask once. You should make the offer once. Now, we have very little research evidence on this, but Rebecca's research suggests that that's not true. That actually, people who have been harmed are really quite pleased to be made the offer a second time, because it may be a more appropriate time for them to say, yeah, I thought about it now, and yeah, perhaps I would like to do this. And what they think about having the offer a second time is, hey, the justice process hasn't forgotten about me. This is great. It really is thinking about me, rather than they're harassing me or something like that. And I think that's important. Why have we got all these implementation difficulties for restorative justice? Well, because it's got loads of stages and involves loads of different people and parties, which I've tried to illustrate by this rather nice crazy paving set of steps on the slide. And I have set out what the different stages are in many cases. Larry Sherman has likened it to peeling an onion. You get through one layer, skin, and you've got another one, and another one, and another one, and so forth. So it's problematic. Sorry about my failure on slides. It also is bound up by the particular justice values that people in the country and people who are employed in criminal justice think about what justice means and what would be the best justice for that particular case. And those values are very significant. They are different in each place and each country. They are values which people hold very dear to their hearts because it's the essence of why they've got into trying to do stuff in relation to criminal justice in the first place. And they can be very different between different professional groups. So if you're a legal professional, you tend to have legally oriented justice values. I mean, that's why you're a lawyer, you know. Those can be different, for example, in how good bringing in professionals is, from what the restorative justice inclusive bottom-up kinds of values are. And that's why you get all this debate and sincerely held and really thoughtful debate about what we're trying to create when we're trying to create criminal justice schemes. They're very hard to change. Trying to create change in criminal justice is like turning an oil tanker. It takes a very long time and it can only turn a very small amount at a particular time. And it's why criminal justice can be so resistant to change and has also strongly the values of consistency, conformity, and resilience over time. An example of that, for example, is in the Netherlands, where the key value about justice is that it's the best you can possibly do as a profession. So bringing in all these lay people and giving them a voice, like the person who's been harmed and the person who has harmed, is not the best you can do as a professional because they're not professionals. And they're not operating according to a professional code of values because they're lay people. And you can see why, therefore, it's been hard to implement restorative justice in the Netherlands, and the relevant agency would tell you it has been hard. And I think there will always be tension between the more professional or the more legal or the more government-held views about justice and the more universalist and inclusive views about justice, which are held by restorative justice advocates and practitioners. And that's partly because it is the crime is the responsibility of the nation state. So that's what I wanted to say. I hope it was vaguely what you were expecting. Those are all the references. Presumably, if this is being recorded and made available, the references will be made available as well, and you'll be able to click on the links, for example, on the video and the evaluation of video and stuff which are in there. I've probably run over by
Thank you so much. And just to confirm, if you're happy for me to share the PowerPoint slides, I can definitely circulate that to all the event attendees, so they will be
as long as I can say that things may have moved on, and I've not known about them. So please, people, in the questions and stuff, do say if that's so, and if I've said anything that you think is wrong.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I look forward to that discussion in a few minutes. Ashley, are you happy to present now?
I am. If you give me 2 seconds, I'll share my screen.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Great. I can see that. That's always a good sign.
And present.
Great.
Fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so can everybody see that? Yes. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me along today to speak about some of the developments that thriving survivors have been involved in the implementation of restorative justice in Scotland. I am Ashley Scotland. I'm the founder and chief executive of Thriving Survivors. Thriving Survivors is an organisation that was established in 2016, and we run ahead of myself. We support survivors of trauma through a 4-stage recovery pathway. The pathway itself is based on Professor Judith Herman's 3-stage model of trauma recovery. And the model itself takes somebody from a point of crisis right the way through to a point of post-traumatic growth and empowerment. So as part of my role, I was attending what would I call it? I would call it a survivor representative meeting. And I was chairing this event. And I apologise to anybody who has heard me speak this story. Most of the people that are on the call from Scotland will be fed up hearing this. But I think it's good just to provide a bit of context. During this meeting, the conversation of restorative justice was tabled as an agenda item. And it was during this point that somebody made this comment to me round the table, that under no circumstances should restorative justice be made available for victims of sexual or domestic abuse. Anybody who knows me knows that I hate an injustice, and that I quite often like to stand on my soapbox and give a right good shout about it. So it was at this point that I actually decided to probe a bit further, and I'll say at this point, I didn't know very much about restorative justice at this point in time. And that's when I reached out to the Scottish Government. And Pamela Stott, who represents Scottish Government, she came along to our next meeting of this group of individuals. And we had a great conversation. And at that point, I realised that there was massive resistance, even having a bit more understanding of where Scottish Government were going with it, and that it would be victim focused and it would be victim led. There was still huge resistance. So it was at this point that I approached Scottish Government and asked if we could run a national consultation for restorative justice. And we had 3 key aims. One was there awareness within Scotland and awareness within survivors of domestic and sexual abuse about restorative justice. The second was, is there a demand for restorative justice? And then the third was, what would you need to see in a service? What would your expectations be if a service were to be made available to you? We carried out several different ways in which people could participate within the consultation itself, and this included the consultation survey, which had 21 open-ended questions where people could give as much or as little as they felt they wanted to. We also held focus groups, which turned out to be an incredible source of data, and what we gathered from that certainly laid the foundations for the development of a service. And we also had a 1-question survey for people who perhaps didn't have time to complete the full questionnaire. We asked, if restorative justice was made available to you, would you access it? So some of the key findings from the consultation demonstrated that survivors' voices must be heard and they must be taken into account in any decision-making process, and that they must have choice in whether they choose to access restorative justice or not. The impact of trauma must be considered in the development of any service and included within the delivery of that service as well. Control and agency over what services they needed and required at any given time, and that survivors of domestic and sexual violence wanted restorative justice to be available to them within Scotland. I will make the full consultation available within the chat once I've finished my presentation, so please feel free to read it. If you've got any questions, please reach out to us. So the consultation was the start of Thriving Survivors' journey into restorative justice, and indeed the start of a conversation across the country. It sort of restarted the conversation that Joanna was talking about in 2010. And I think there was a real recognition that this was the last opportunity that we would have in this country to really try and embed it. And we're delighted to have been at the forefront of those developments, and certainly where we're at in Scotland now. So as part of the consultation process, we asked people what they would need. And like I say, that consultation laid the foundations for service development. So alongside Dr. Estelle Sinstag, we created a joint proposal that went to Scottish Government to actually design and to develop a service. And I'm delighted to say that that has now been very successfully completed. And we now have 4 different services that people can access. They are busy and they're in demand, which is great. And I will provide you some case study at the end. So within these services, we essentially, the focus groups that we used within the consultation were so rich and so valuable that we decided to keep that running. And that eventually became what is now known as our Lived Experienced Action Group. And this group were fundamental to the development of these services. So we have your traditional restorative justice meeting between the person who was harmed and the person who caused harm. We also recognise that one of the key themes that came from the consultation was the level of victimisation that took place at the hands of services and systems. So we created a secondary harm service. And again, this is a busy service at this moment in time, where we are supporting survivors to engage in restorative practice and restorative conversations with systems and services within Scotland, which is fabulous. The next key theme that came up was the need for a whole family approach to healing harm. And that's when we decided to develop our family healing circles and our family service. Again, this is a very busy service with a predominant referral coming in for families affected by sibling sexual abuse, which was an unexpected turn. We could never have seen that would be the demand, and that's where it's coming from. And the final service that we developed was our restorative cafe. So using a World Cafe model, we developed a 6-week programme. Using that model, we look at different things, different themes each week. So we look at trauma, we look at recovery, we look at harm, we look at love, we look at relationships. So there's a whole host of different themes that we look at within that restorative cafe model and service. And that is now embedded within stage 4 of Thriving Survivors services, which is great. So all of these services have just become part of Thriving Survivors' core working model and can be made available to any survivor who wishes to access it from within the service, and which again is great. But what that's also allowed us to do is to be able to provide people who perhaps might not be ready for restorative justice, or perhaps the proceeding might just be too many risks involved, then actually we can give them access to our 4-stage recovery pathway, and people can be supported to actually explore their trauma and the experiences that they've had within Thriving Survivors core services. So I'll move on to the delivery and impact. Before I do that, Dr. Estelle Sinstag and Clara Winsfield were responsible for carrying out a piece of research, and it was supposed to be like an action research piece. We are still awaiting publication approval from the Scottish Government, but that will be an amazing piece of research that will provide a valued contribution to knowledge and provides an overview of how we did this and what work went into it, the people that were involved. So a huge amount of work had went into those first 2 years of delivery. As we all know, funding pots are getting tighter and tighter, but more importantly, thriving survivors successfully completed the task in hand. We were tasked with designing and developing a service that was specific for survivors of sexual violence and domestic abuse. Well, sexual violence, sorry, we don't, not currently supporting anybody affected by domestic abuse. And we done that. So in March, the end of March 2024, our funding came to an end with Scottish Government. And what happened is we have now moved to a fund per case model, which has helped us step in to the delivery of cases. I've also got another funder, which has allowed us to fully step into the delivery of sexual harm cases. So the Robertson Trust are fully responsible for the costs of delivering our sexual harm service, which is fabulous because it's needed, and the ability and the freedom to step into cases is just great. You know, it's further than we were able to go before. So as you'll see, we now have over 20 active cases. These range from homicide cases to institutional cases to family cases, right the way through to the newest sort of part of our service, which is working with children and young people. So by way of case study, I will use a few examples today. So we have currently, we've got a homicide case. The homicide case is progressing really well. We have got an institution involved in helping us to support the delivery of that. So that's seen as have one of our, which we termed our flying squad. We don't call them that anymore. We've got our trained facilitators that sit within other organisations. So as part of the development, Estelle had developed a specialist training programme, and we had delivered 4 levels of training. And that allowed us to train people from other organisations as well. And this has worked so well because when the case came up, we were able to call on one of those people who had been trained, but also who sat within that organisation. So what's happening is we've got somebody based within the organisation and somebody from Thriving Survivors, and they are both working in partnership to support both parties through a piece of communication. This has not come without its challenges, I will say. Each case has been completely different to the other, and a lot of the things that we had on paper is not what it looks like in practice, and I don't suppose we would have known that until we stepped into it. One of the institutional cases that we have is, again, another challenging case, and the difficulty with that is that organisations, systems and institutions have got existing policy and practice and ways of working. And often that doesn't include the use of restorative practice, and it very seldom includes somebody out with a HR team coming in to support. So this has been a hugely interesting piece of work to undertake. It's still in progress at the moment, but it is progressing well. And what that's allowed is for people to start addressing the impact of the harm. But we're also now supporting people, like I say, through that 4-stage process that we've got within Thriving Survivors, whilst also supporting the delivery of a restorative case for that person. Family cases, these are fast becoming our biggest referral, with a particular focus on sibling sexual abuse. So I'll give another example of a case that we're currently holding, where we were approached by mum, and mum was looking for some help to be able to support her 2 young children after this experience had happened within the family home. And mum was struggling to navigate all the different organisations and people involved in the process. So we've got police, we've got education, we've got health, then you've got third sector also involved within that, as well as social work. And mum was trying to navigate all these different services and was really struggling under the pressure. So what initially came in as a restorative justice request and case soon became Thriving Survivors hosting a family care plan and getting each individual member of that family into one-to-one support and allowing them the opportunity to start a process of healing whilst somebody had control of all the different professionals within that and was able to hold a space for that family care plan to come together. We are now 6 months into the delivery of that case, and at this point we are now looking at reunification of family, which is it's just phenomenal to see the impact of service. And then we've got another case, which is
sorry, actually, just one moment. We've not been able to see your slides going through, so do you just want to check? Have you been using slides as you've been going through or not?
What was my last slide?
Oh, sorry, I should have butted in a bit earlier. I wasn't sure. I didn't want to interrupt if you weren't using the slides at that time. We haven't been able to see them moving through at all.
Okay, so I'm on slide 4. Well, it should have
slide number 1.
I don't know what's happening there. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just stop my share because you just don't need it. So
yeah, okay, sorry.
Not at all.
I can always send through a copy. If you can send me a copy after the event, I can always circulate it to the attendees later.
Perfect, that'll do. Yeah, I don't need my slides anyway, so don't worry.
It's been fantastic though, so do carry on.
Yeah, so the impact of service is just phenomenal to see. To see people having what we're offering offers hope, and it offers opportunity for people that haven't had nowhere to turn for such a long time. When we're working with families, there's another family that we're working with, and it's been 7 years since the incident took place. And the family, it was like a grenade going off in the family. And when we stepped in and we started supporting the parents, they spoke of the joy at being able to finally have somewhere where they could both be seen and they could both be heard and they could both go through a process together, but separately. So the actual impact of service has blown us away. We've delivered several restorative cafes now, and to different groups of people as well. And these again have been incredibly impactful, and I've got some reports on them which I'm also happy to share with everybody at the end. So I'll pass them on to Joy and let everybody have a look at those. Some of the work recently has taken us into working with children and young people, and specifically in and around the sort of family service. And this, I suppose, was an unexpected outcome. It was never a direction that we thought we would take. However, the demand and the need for service and the need for a response to that demand led us to bringing in the right capabilities within our team and making sure we had the right people. But it's also allowed us to really step into that individual piece of work with everybody involved within the family. So I think I'm conscious of time, and I'm sure people will have questions, Joy. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people have. Also send the slides and all the support and documentation as well.
Perfect, thank you so much. We're happy to take some questions now. I don't think we've had any questions as we've gone on in the chat. But if anyone would like to add it now, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, or if you yourself are also in Scotland and want to chip in with your experience. Now is the time. I can see a physical hand raised from Jeff.
Yes, can't do. Oh, I've now got a virtual hand. Those presentations were fascinating. Thank you, Joanna, for kind of giving us so much context and getting us kind of more up to date. And hearing about thriving survivors was fascinating. Actually, I mean, one question is, how have you made your service? Well, created public awareness. And to Joanna, a question, I see myself as an expert on embedding based entirely on failure. Absolutely. So successful projects, so the JRC research, reducing reoffending and so on, in prisons and in probation, working with prisons and probation rather like spinning plates, and you had to rush around, and neither prisons nor, well, prisons in rare circumstances are taking restorative justice forward. Probation, I'm not aware. I mean, a little bit out of current touch, but it feels like failure. And then a project in Bullingdon working to try and find an alternative to the kind of failed prison discipline system. Some success, long-term success, totally lacking. Project closed when the governor was no longer interested. So it's embedding. And so they're the two questions, really. Well, that's not a question, is it, Joanna? That's a statement. But public awareness, how can it be achieved? And or greater public awareness, and how, I mean, is there examples from other research of successful projects then just disappearing and evaporating when management interest within prisons and probation falls away?
Ashley, do you want to take that first question?
Yeah, so I'll pick up on that. I suppose one of the reasons our service became so publicly known was because of the controversy in and around it. So there was such resistance and pushback to what we were trying to do that actually it created a space in Scotland for us to be able to, I suppose, take advantage of the noise. You know, we launched with the Minister for Justice at that moment in time, which was Keith Brown. And again, I think that helped. We had interest from the BBC. In fact, I was speaking to the person from the BBC just a couple of weeks ago, which is great because they are still interested and they are still following the story. But we also have other journalists who are keen to hear more. We're also very vocal and we've got a very public social media. So we've got quite a big following, and we attend events like this, but more importantly, we build collaborations and partnerships with other organisations within Scotland. And that's been an absolutely invaluable resource of being able to, because when the referral came in for one of the homicide cases, it came from within the organisation that we had sort of made contact with and sort of started to build relationships with. So I think that's the way forward, is it must be done in collaboration. None of us can do this alone. And I think sometimes that's been the missing piece, as everybody's tried to do bits on their own and it's not been very well joined up. So for me, collaboration's at the heart of the success in terms of letting people know how to access our services.
Thank you. Joanna, do you have any thoughts on that sort of second question about, I guess, longevity or successful projects?
Yeah, sure. One should not take away from all the difficulties of implementation I was talking about that you're going to fail. You should definitely not do that, because there are a lot of examples of restorative justice strengthening and becoming more widely available, and of which probably the most obvious is in Northern Ireland in all sorts of different ways. So from the original pilots, which had all their own problems then, through to the legislation, which was, of course, only for young people who had harmed, but it's gone down so well. And restorative justice has been so broadly accepted across the political parties, which is quite difficult in Northern Ireland, but it's one of the rare examples which everybody is in agreement on. And so it's the public that we've now got thousands of people who've been involved in youth conferences on one side or another. And it really is actively being promoted for adult people who have harmed. It was just waiting for political developments at Stormont to be able to actually sort out how to do things. One is always going to get problems with implementing change, and you're always going to need, however good the evaluation results are, and I have to say for restorative justice, they tend to be better evaluation results than for almost all other initiatives in criminal justice, quite honestly. But even if that is so, you still need political will. You need the key leaders, both in government and in criminal justice agencies, such as the Chief Constable or equivalent, to be in favour. And that's what happened initially in Scotland with the guidance and the initial big trial area. But then politicians change and leaders change, and Ashley is nodding at me as well. And we have now a new First Minister, a very new First Minister in Scotland, and some new ministers, and I don't know what their exact views are. I do know that, like all governments everywhere, the Scottish government is feeling a bit pressed on the financial side, that it's going to be really difficult to get new items into the budget or expand items in the budget. And I'm delighted that Ashley has got other funders as well to keep the service going and so forth. And I'm also actually delighted, if I may say it, that that has been accompanied by doing an evaluation, because that's absolutely key to constantly be able to get into the ear of government or agencies and make them feel that this is the right thing to offer. Remembering that restorative justice is entirely voluntary to potential participants. So they can say no, and that's absolutely fine. And so it should be. But what we have to do is to somehow try to get to the point where they're able to say no. And so that was what my presentation was trying very hard to look at. What do you have to do to actually get it offered, so that they can say yay, or perhaps not yet, or no.
I'll come to you, Mary, in a minute. I can see you've raised your hand, but there's also been a question which I wanted to come to now, so I think it's related to what you were just speaking about, Joanna. So perhaps Ashley can also chip in with her thoughts. But do you have a sense about whether the Scottish Government will stick to their ambition to provide restorative justice to everyone who wants it, or how actively they're working on those barriers? I don't know if either of you.
Well, I did say that I cannot speak on behalf of the Scottish Government. I really should not and must not and cannot. But I do know from recent-ish meetings that it's still the aim. The vision is still the vision. It's just that the time scale of the vision has very definitely elongated. And there's a real appreciation that there needs to be some things ironed out, particularly in relation to certain, often actually quite rare scenarios, but which could occur if it's for all cases. So supposing somebody hasn't reported to the police, what are you going to do then? That was actually also, in fact, a live issue at one point in Northern Ireland as well, and the possibility of double jeopardy, which did occur, between community restorative justice providers and the statutory stuff and so forth for young offenders. Yeah. So do I think it's going to happen? I seriously hope so. I think there's a real wish and will, and amongst people in Community Justice Scotland as well. Do I think it's going to happen soon? No. Is one going to be able to unpick the criminal justice knots? Yeah, I think eventually, but actually one of the key needs is to keep it going and keep the trial cases going. And I know that is happening, both in relation to what Ashley and so on are doing, but also in relation to numerically more common types of case and so forth, where there is a real demand, need as well.
Great. Ashley, do you have anything else to add from your interactions?
No, I don't think so.
Great. Merrin, you've had your hand up for a while. What did you want to contribute? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. I some while ago I had some contact from some people who I think it was a group of Scottish Quakers, some of whom had done some training in restorative justice. And some of them hadn't, but they, I mean, in general, Quakers are very interested in restorative justice and do their best to promote it. But they were worried about what seemingly sort of Scottish restorative justice seeming to be into running before they could walk. So there's this kind of very successful, high-profile project, but there didn't seem to be much going on in terms of the kind of more run-of-the-mill type offences, and that they were a bit worried about that, and I was curious as well, and I know you've mentioned that there were some pilot projects, but I wonder if you could kind of say something about the kind of gap in the middle, as it were, and what is happening and what is hoped to happen with that, and how training is going ahead or not. Because the other thing about training is it's okay to train people, but then if you haven't got anything for them to do afterwards, it's slightly disappointing and a bit of a waste, because you've only got to retrain them when there is something to do. So it's about the kind of gaps in between, really.
Yes. I completely agree with you with your point about training. And there's also some research evidence from elsewhere, for example, with the Thames Valley Police study, which is long ago now, that you do actually need to give people practice and develop them. If you ever want them, if you want trained people to develop and take on more difficult and more sensitive or more complex cases as well as different training on that. Scotland, I think, did have an incredibly ambitious aim, and I don't actually really think that it was ever going to be able to make that happen by 2023. I don't think any country has ever managed to do things that fast. And the worry now is that it stutters and stalls and people become discouraged. And the people that come to forum meetings and so on are, I think, also worried about that. And I hope it's not going to happen. But it is difficult if you haven't really worked out who is going to make the offer, which I think is the key thing. And if whoever it is that is going to make the offer has not agreed that they're going to make the offer, then you're a bit stuck. The history of England and Wales, which is perhaps less sensitive politically, on this is, I think, illustrative of this, in that the police now have a statutory duty to make the offer, and they know that, and they've agreed it. It's in legislation. They're still not all doing it wonderfully, but actually, chief constables have got worried about the offer not being made, to everyone it should be made to, and so have put in place some at least action projects to improve it happening. And we evaluated one of those, which is in the references on the last slide of my presentation. This was done in South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire and Humberside. And the lesson from that, which was a 2-year project, was that it took a long time to get started and really get up and going, and people had the right champions had to be there, and the right squads and the training and all the rest of it. But actually, by the time the project was ending after 2 years, it was really starting to have a real effect. So if you're going to embed it, which was Jeff's original question, then you've not only got to have real oomph from the top and continue to have at least some oomph from the top, but you've then got to actually have a whole corpus of people who really want to take it forward amongst the frontline staff, who are going to promote referrals, be prepared to take on cases, not feel nervous, and so forth. And that's what those forces did manage in many ways to do. And I think what has happened is a lesson in relation to a lot of what has happened in Thames Valley as well, that there was a sufficient large number of people who were keen and could do it. How to make that happen is, I'm afraid, all about the tone from the top. So we need more ministers and leaders who are really keen to really promote it and talk about it. We are very fortunate in the United Kingdom that TV is continuously interested in restorative justice, and there have been some wonderful programs and storylines in soaps and so forth that have occurred, and each time it produces a fillip of more public awareness and so forth, and that's really helpful. Thanks.
Martina, you've had your hand up for a while. What would you like to say?
Hi. So I am working for the Department of Justice in Northern Ireland. Joanna, I think I've met you before in Leeds. I worked in youth conferencing for 12 years, so I was there from the beginning of the development of restorative justice in the youth justice system in Northern Ireland. So it has just last year celebrated 20 years. And the model that was applied, that we started 20 years ago, has been sustained very, very successfully. I can tell you today we have 6 young people in custody, 4 on remand and 2 sentenced, which is really disappointing for us because we have not had any sentenced young people in custody for quite a while. Our process is very much diversion driven. Diversion. We have very few young people going to prosecution. So it's early intervention, is dealing with restorative cautions, restorative community resolution notices. It's a real focus for us, and we're very proud of it. Now, Joanna, just to update you, we have started the Adult Restorative Justice Protocol. I'm the protocol lead for this. So at the moment, we had a restorative justice strategy, which was shelved for a little while the executive got itself up and running again, but we are really pushing now to get this off the ground. And that is very much DOJ led. Our minister is very supportive of restorative justice. We still have, it opens it up to a lot of more community-based restorative justice projects to take on referrals and maybe take on more criminal justice referred cases as well, depending on their competency and capacity. So it's really exciting. We would like to replicate the success of our youth justice system to some degree, but I know, having worked with young people, there are distinct differences in working with adults. The other thing about victims, and again, Joanna, I was actually referencing you yesterday about the offer of RJ, because police are now starting to do restorative community resolution notices, and I'm kind of, again, referencing yourself about attrition levels and making sure that those who make the offer know what they're talking about and they're able to answer questions. So it is very exciting. We, as I said, the Department of Justice is really working very hard to get this off the ground. We in Youth Justice had the beauty of having our RJ legislated for, so compelled judges and prosecutors to consider RJ for all cases other than indictable offences. And even at that stage, what we're thinking of now is even if offences were indictable and very complex or serious offences weren't dealt with at the lower court, that at some stage the victims of those offences should get the opportunity to meet with those who caused them harm. So we have a real passion for RJ here, probably driven by the difficult conversations we had to enter into in order to access peace. We still have paramilitary influence to some degree over here, but again, this is about encouraging those at risk of being involved in paramilitarism or criminality to actually engage with restorative justice instead and we want this to become a way of life. So for those of you who may be worried, when's this going to take off? It has taken a while. I definitely think the legislation was a fantastic framework from which to, I suppose, kickstart this. But to be honest, I think it's now in our DNA. A lot of people here know what RJ is, and they've heard of it either in schools or in the community. What was very interesting, there was the reference, I think, between the professionalism and the state, the government and government organisations and community-based restorative justice. We do not want to professionalise community-based RJ because it is in their bones. We don't want them to become, what's the word for it, where you kind of sanitize in a way to make it look more palatable for government organisations, but yet it has to be, of high level, the practice. So I just wanted to share that with you because we're starting this journey, but we're really confident that it will work because of the success of youth conferencing. So there you go.
Thank you, Martina. Rosie, I think you had a question for Ashley about potential interest from partners. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that question. I think you're muted, so you might have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. I think someone else should have a turn first, Jo. There was a question from Jen, wasn't there, a little while back?
Yes, let me have a look back. Yes, so Jen asks, is the main issue promotion or potential provision? Ashley, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question.
I think at this moment in time, we're able to meet the level of demand that's coming in. If we were to go with we've not sort of went with a full-scale promotion because we are a small team, we've got limited funds, and we are just sort of taking what we can get. If we were to fully advertise that we are now open, we can take any type of case, the floodgates would open. So I don't think it's promotion or provision. I think it's the funds that's needed to actually be able to, because we could scale up. So I'm currently working across Shetland and Orkney. So I'm working with one of the universities up that way. And we are starting to train a team of people up in the north of Scotland, which is great because we're able to actually respond to the level of need and being able to respond to that. But in order for us to be able to bring those members of staff in and to actually have them functioning properly, so as that we can promote a service, we need the resource that goes behind that in terms of the financial commitment. And like Joanna says, that depends on who you've got in power at any given time. We are really fortunate in that we are not tied to Scottish Government, which means we have been able to go and source funding elsewhere, and we continue to do so. So my hope is that the funding will keep coming in. It allows us to build bigger teams across Scotland, and allow us to be able to then advertise and promote the service in a sort of wider, larger scale. But at this moment in time, I would say the issue is funding and resource.
Yeah. And do you receive referrals from the police or from the criminal justice system, or do people just come directly from you who find out about your service?
Yeah, so we've had some, so we've had lots of self-referrals. We've had agency referrals such as social work. We've had an education referral. We've had institution referrals as well. So the net is quite wide, and I think that happened as a result of the annual conference that we held last year. So we held the sort of first Restorative Justice Conference, like dedicated conference in Scotland last year, which had over 200 people attend over the 2 days. So I think allowing that space for people to come and hear more about what we do and how we do it actually then opened up those referral pathways, and everything that we do is backed up by research and evidence as well. So there's now looking at bringing in the University of Bristol and the University of Birmingham under an ESRC funded placement. So we're actually going to have somebody for 12 months on placement, and it's fully funded as well, so it's of no cost to Thrive and Survivor. So all of that will feed in to where we take it next.
Amazing. That's incredible. I'll come back to Rosie now.
Yeah, so my question was for Ashley, was about whether or not you've had much interest from partners in England or internationally in the service models you've developed.
Yes, so we've had 4 referrals now from England and Wales, so we're actually currently facilitating them. We've had referrals from Germany, Australia, the United States and Ireland as well. So we do have international reach at the moment, and I don't know why, I can't explain it, but the referrals are coming in. Of course, we are unable to respond to some of those that come in internationally, but watch this space is what I would say.
It's very exciting, thank you. We have just a few more minutes before we need to wrap up. Are there any other last questions or comments from anyone? That Rosie again, I see you raising your hand.
If I could sneak in a further question, it'd be really interesting. I'd be really interested to know a bit more from Ashley about the work you've been doing with what you call secondary victims. So, you know, victims of services and systems. Yeah, I think there were probably a lot of that type of victim.
Yes, so I'm unable to give too much information away in terms of the organisation that we're working with, because it will instantly identify. Yeah, I need to be careful in terms of what I say, but this is definitely the most difficult delivery we've came up against, and it is because they have existing policies and procedures in place, and we're essentially coming in and disrupting that. What I will say is the organisation is open to it. One case within the institution led to 3. So when we were working with one person, there was another 2 people that actually came forward. So I think for the organisation, there's a big risk in terms of they need to respond, which I think is why they've opened the door and allowed these initial conversations to start taking place. But it's not moving as quickly as some of our other cases, and that is because we are navigating a system that's been in place for a very long time and that is set in its ways, I think I'll describe it as. So I would definitely say one of the secondary victimisation services cases that we have is complicated and is unlike what we expected, I think is what I would say at this moment in time. We hope that other organisations soon get involved and sort of get on board, but it is difficult getting the buy-in from some of these big organisations because we're looking at systems that have been in place for over 100 years for some people. So it is a big change, and what we're offering is very, very different to how they currently do things. So the biggest challenge for us has definitely been navigating their existing policies and procedures and trying to unpick some of that so as they'll let us in the door.
Thank you. We're about to run out of time. I can see that I've had Marian's raising a hand. We also had another question that I managed to miss from Lara in the chat as well about victim-centred and victim-led restorative justice practice, but I can see, Ashley, that you responded to her. So hopefully you can continue that discussion elsewhere, because that also sounds like a very interesting topic. But I think we are running out of minutes now to discuss that fully. Perhaps that can be a topic of another discussion further at another event, or as you said, just amongst yourselves. I'm sorry, Marian, I think we're going to run out of time to come to your question now. But thank you everyone for coming. It's been really, really great to have all of you here. As I said before, we would love to have your feedback. So if you could fill in the evaluation form, we'll put the link in the chat again in just a minute. That'd be really, really helpful. We don't actually have any kind of next network event style events like this coming up that we have kind of put in the diary yet. We're working on our programme of events for the rest of the year. So please do let us know, either send me an email or on that evaluation form. Let me know if there's any particular events or topics that you would really like to explore further. I'd be really interested to know about that. Also, again, if you are willing and able to donate to Mint House, that'd be great. We're a very small charity. So any resource that you have that can help us to continue to put on these events would be really appreciated by us. And also, if you didn't tick the box when you signed up to say that you're happy to go on our mailing list, I can't keep your email address, good old GDPR regulations. So if you didn't tick that box and you're not on our mailing list but would like to be, particularly if you want to hear when we do announce our future events, then please do sign up to our newsletter. So I'll put those links in the chat now. I've seen there's been lots of really interesting discussion going on in the chat about other topics as well, a little bit about work in prisons, for instance. So before I close the call, if any of that is of interest to you, do feel free to scroll through the chat and note down some of those email addresses of other people if that's something that you're wanting to connect with other people on, and continue to make those connections with other people outside of this event. That's one thing we love to do, is to help facilitate those connections between different people who have similar interests and are doing similar work. So yeah, obviously do scroll through, make sure you save those email addresses and make a note of those before I close the chat. Although I will have a copy of the chat saved afterwards. So if you do leave and then think, oh no, I forgot, send me an email later. I'll put my email also in the chat. And you can also contact me and I'll try to help to make those connections if possible. Any last words from Ashley or from Joanna?
No.
Otherwise,
anybody wants to get in touch, drop us an email.
And ditto, the same. My email is on the last slide of the presentation.
that's right. And thank you so much, particularly to Joanna and to Ashley for joining us today. It's really helpful to have your insights and to hear your experiences and the journey that you've been involved in. So thank you so much, and we will hopefully see you at another event soon.